the Singapore University of Technology and Design, SUTD. More importantly, this debate allows everyone, from students, architects in practice, professors, and many more, to gain insights and generate more ideas about the current issues in our industry. Now, I will be starting off the event with a brief run-through of today's programs. I will first be doing a short introduction to the teams, the judges, the prizes, as well as the rules of today's debate. After the introduction, we will commence our debate. As most of you have done before settling down, you should have already cast your vote for which team you think are going to win this debate. But who will be the final winner? I hope you are ready to immerse yourself in the architectural discourse that is the debate. At 3:30, we will be inviting the audience to cast their votes. As we count these votes, we will invite everyone to walk around the ongoing archival exhibition and enjoy the works from all cohorts of NUS students from the past academic year. Lastly, at 3:50 p.m., we will gather again at the SDE 3 Archival Exhibition Level 1 to announce the debate winners. Without further ado, let me introduce you to our judging panel for today. We are honored to have 3 judges for today who are very experienced in the architecture industry. Firstly, we have architect Tia Nan Chuan, Director of FARM and the Vice President of the Singapore Institute of Architects. We also have Dr. Simone Cheng, who is an Assistant Professor at the Department of Architecture, National University of Singapore. Last but not least, we have Prof. Christine Yogerman, who is an Assistant Professor at SUTD and also the founding partner of Yogerman Tracy Design. Thank you again to our judges for joining us today. We are very honored to have people of your expertise to critique the session and decide on the best speaker later on. Now let's give a big round of applause to welcome our 2 debate teams. From the SUTD proposition team, the team is led by Prof. Daniel Whittaker, and the team comprises of Chua, Shuei, Eusebius, and Paraaga, Raghavendra. Representing the NUS opposition team, we have the team mentor, Dr. Johannes Widodo, and the team comprises Seet and Diana Kondratova. As mentioned earlier, the SUTD team will be the proposition party, whereas the NUS team will be the opposition team. Before we get to the debate motion and rules, we would like to thank the Architecture Society and the NUS Department of Architecture for supporting this event. Special thanks also go out to the SUTDO and SUTD for assisting with publicity and being part of this event. We would also like to thank our sponsors, DCA Architects as our platinum sponsor, ADAS, AGA Architects, Ernesto Bedmar, and SCDA Architects as our gold sponsors. And our silver sponsors, Ashwin Kumar, DP Architects, Farm Architects, Forum Architects, Park Class Associates, and Richard Ho Architects. Finally, we have come to our debate motion. Honoring the heritage of buildings in Singapore can only be done through preserving them. More than just mere physical structure, architecture represents the identity, culture, and history of a place and its people. In Singapore, a city-state with a rich history and cultural heritage, architecture reflects the diverse influences of its past, from colonial buildings to modern skyscrapers. The debate over preserving heritage buildings in Singapore is complex and multifaceted. It involves balancing the need to honor Singapore's heritage and cultural identity with the need for innovation and development. The question then arises of how this balance can be created and what indeed best honors the heritage of the architecture in Singapore. The debate will have the following sequence. We will start with Proposition 1, an introduction of key areas and to propose a proposition. Afterwards, opposition will have a go to rebut and propose their stand. Then this year, we have introduced a new element of a crossfire, and so the teams will confer after the opposition has said their stance before diving into a crossfire. Proposition 2 and Opposition 2 will have a similar rebuttal and introduce a new stance, after which the second crossfire will take place. The teams will have 4 minutes each time to make their stance. Afterwards, we will invite the judges to pose a few questions to both sides, where the debaters will then have to respond. We will then open the floor to 3 questions, of which the debaters will also respond to, so this is where the audience can come in to ask any questions. After the Q&A session, the team would then be allowed to share their closing remarks, with the NUS team going first, then SUTD. To conclude the session, we will then allow the judges to share their remarks and critique the debate. There will be 2 prizes for today: the best speaker, which will be decided by the judges, and of course, the winning team, decided by audience voting and scoring by our judges at the end of the debate. Now, to take it away, we first have Team NUS.
Okay, so honoring the heritage of buildings in Singapore can only be done through preserving them. Preservation, of course, is perhaps a good attempt to save the heritage. However, today we're here discussing whether or not we're honoring it. It then becomes easy to disagree with this statement, and we will try to uncover the truth by starting with understanding of terminology. Let us first define the term preservation and conservation. Did you know that Singapore is one of the few countries that does not use these 2 terms interchangeably? According to the National Heritage Board, preservation, in short, is saving the architecture of the past with a focus of national monuments identified by URA and PSA. The way Singapore is preserving these heritage sites is merely a surface-level approach. From the National Gallery to Space Asia Hub, only the architecture itself remains, while the soul of the building is long forgotten. What does retaining the shell even accomplish? It is true that preserving historically valuable buildings does honor their heritage. However, the extent to which this is successful can be questioned. At the end of the day, merely retaining the shell of what once was does not truly honor the past in our present. Honor is another term that we should further define, a word of great weight and responsibility. However, what does true honor mean? A surface-level understanding of the term may suggest that in regards to memory keeping a piece of something that what once was, a window into history is sufficient for us to honor heritage. However, honor at its core is emotional, intangible. It cannot be grasped or replicated. It can only be felt and passed on through memory. We then ask, why do we preserve and what is preservation? It is simple. We preserve in order to offer a glimpse of history into our present modern world. We preserve so as not to forget. We preserve to attempt or pretend to honor. This reasoning begs the question, how truly effectively preserved are the buildings we're here to discuss today? After thorough deliberation, we finally concluded that we cannot truly honor the heritage of a building without checking the following 5 principles. Number 1 is environmental sustainability. If a building, as it were, still stands and is habitable in its current state, demolishing it would waste all the new physical resources. However, likewise, preserving a building and letting it sit and decay without an appropriate adaptive use into the modern world, as in the case of National Gallery's Supreme Court room and prison basements, it wastes even more resources and space, which in Singapore's context are very significant factors. Number 2 is economic viability. In our world, anything has to make financial sense. Any preserved building has to be occupied and used by the population, or be integrated into the tourist consumption in order to have financial value. Number 3 is architectural integrity. How do we adopt the old into the new, make history relevant into our modern world while preserving the ways and technologies of the past? Number 4 is cultural authenticity, which can be directly tied to economical viability. Is the existing heritage of the building. In respect to preservation, this would entail an experience that is raw and true to the past time frame when the building was inhabited. Number 5, social continuity. Heritage is heavily influenced by communities and events. Even when the building and architectural facade is preserved, is heritage truly honored without its involved communities?
Good afternoon, afternoon to all those present here. Today as the proposition team, we stand before you to affirm the statement that honoring the heritage of buildings in Singapore can only be done through preserving them. We firmly believe that the preservation of these remarkable buildings along a wide latitude of reuse is essential in paying homage to the rich heritage that defines Singapore. Firstly, the Golden Mile complex stands as a testament to Singapore's architectural heritage, reflecting the distinctive brutalist style that was influential during its construction. The Telakaya Market, one of the oldest hawker centers, represents the historical significance of trade and the multicultural heritage of the area. Sri Mariamman Temple, Singapore's oldest Hindu temple, is a cherished religious site, symbolizing the importance of diversity and religious freedom in our society. Secondly, the Bukit Timah railway station, the Old Changi Hospital, and Bukit Brown Cemetery hold stories that resonate with our collective colonist-era memory. They serve as reminders of Singapore's resilience through times of war and conflict, reminding us that sacrifices made by those who came before us. Preserving these buildings not only pays tribute to our history, but also educates future generations about Singapore's journey to independence and the strength of its people. Lastly, the National Gallery, Chimes, and Space Asia Hub exemplify the successful marriage of preservation and adaptive reuse. These buildings have been repurposed, transforming them into thriving cultural, artistic, and commercial centers. The National Gallery houses priceless artworks that tell us the story of Singapore's artistic heritage. Chimes, a historical complex, has been lovingly restored and now serves as a vibrant hub for arts, culture, and entertainment. The Space Asia Hub stands as a shining example of adaptive reuse, showcasing how businesses can breathe new life into heritage buildings while preserving their historical value. Now I will pass on to Ray.
Thank you. Honoring the heritage of buildings in Singapore is a paramount task that can only be effectively accomplished through their conservation. Doing so is a two-step process. Firstly, the influence a building has had on the development of its community must be affirmed and acknowledged, its role and history within the society that built and used it recognized. Then its past importance to present society must be respected and held in esteem. The retention and conservation of the appearance of a building keeps its history firmly in the public view. With its exterior facade unchanged even as time passes, the building becomes a tangible link to a community's past, becoming a symbol of their cultural and historical fabric. Therefore, through the preservation of past buildings, we not only retain their physical structures, but also safeguard the stories, traditions, and memories associated with them for past and current generations. In doing so, society is effectively forced to confront a building's role and influence on them. Continuing to preserve a building means to accept, respect, and treasure that building's heritage. In contrast, the replacement and changing of a building structure and facade is to physically erase its past and hence its heritage. Preserving these buildings is not merely an act of nostalgia, but a commitment to our future. By honoring our architectural heritage, we cultivate a sense of pride, identity, and continuity among Singaporeans. We provide future generations with a tangible link to their roots, fostering an understanding and appreciation of our diverse cultural tapestry. To preserve a building for adaptive reuse is therefore honor its heritage. Hence, the Singapore University of Technology and Design advocates that honoring the heritage of buildings in Singapore can only be done through preserving them.
So, in conclusion, as Paraaga and Ray have introduced here, society's heritage and cultural identity is best honored through the broad adaptive reuse of historical architectural forms. Embodied energy and hence embodied carbon of the built environment is conserved through the reuse of these buildings. The collective memory of society, transferred from generation to generation, ensures continuity of understanding of the triumphs and difficulties the past have had, hence defining what is progress. We, as proponents of historic building conservation, shall demonstrate that the adaptive reuse of these buildings and heritage sites for communities to insert new and innovative uses for redevelopment interests, both governmental and private, retains their heritage. Thank you.
Now we will commence the conferring time. You'll have 3 minutes to confer before a 3-minute crossfire afterwards, so that both teams are able to crossfire. Yeah. now start the crossfire for 3 minutes. Whichever team, please go ahead.
Okay. The way we preserve in Singapore is very much top-down approach, and we have an issue with that because first and foremost, it's not very ethical, or it doesn't really honor the heritage of the people. Heritage can be split into the tangible and the intangible. Intangible being your religion, your activities, your everything that the community performs. And tangible being buildings and memorials, etc. The tangible only exists because the intangible firstly took place. It's a byproduct of the intangible, the people. How can we truly preserve and honor something if you completely forget about the roots and the people, the communities that essentially occupied and made this space be in the first place? As in the case of Golden Mile, right? Of course, right now it's still a question mark, but on promising false hope to the Thai communities that have been occupying the space, and of course, maybe eventually they'll be relocated, but they are the people that made the place feel alive. They're the people that gave it soul, and taking it away and repurposing it is not honoring the heritage that made the building be.
So previously, the opposition stated that the preservation of the building is to keep its. If it only keeps the exterior shell of the building, then the preservation effort is essentially worthless, right? It loses its soul. We beg to defer. We feel that keeping the shell, right, but having a building be repurposed or readapted for a different thing, right, helps it transcend its original meaning and its past, right, may even add to its current meaning. Like, for example, the Bukit railway station recently opened 1-2 years ago, right? And now it's become, previously from its function as a railway station, it's now become a nature walk, an ecological corridor to help conserve Singapore's biodiversity. And having its history as a railway station, right, helps to add to its current value. Because it's there to see, its exterior facade is still the same, so it's a public reminder. Any person that goes there is constantly reminded of its previous history. They're educated on its history because there are exhibits there that inform them about it. And experiencing the railway so intimately on that nature walk, walking along the rail, seeing the nature, and it puts you in that headspace of being able to help experience that past. So we would argue that even though the purpose and usage of a building has changed, right, keeping its exterior facade, right, in this way helps to strengthen its present purpose.
Actually, we would like to probably add something against the viewpoint. When you preserve something, as we do in Singapore, with, for example, the railway station, or I would like to refer to Lau Pa Sat. When I first moved to Singapore, when you observe a national monument, it has a lot of power to dictate how history was in our present world. You go to a place, you experience it, you read different signs. Okay. But for example, Lau Pa Sat, how many of you guys know that Lau Pa Sat wasn't actually located where it is today initially? It was moved 2 times before its present location, but nowhere is it ever mentioned. So preservation then becomes a very interesting and powerful tool to dictate history, which is not honoring heritage. It's erasing what once was and creating a narrative that's appropriate to the present.
Okay, now we will move into opposition 2 by NUS.
As mentioned previously, heritage can be generally split into three categories: tangible, which is usually known as historical sites, monuments, artifacts; natural, flora and fauna, landscapes; and the intangible, customs, religion, traditions, folklore, and craft. This is important to recognize that the tangible, which we see the most emphasis on in Singapore, only exists as a byproduct of the intangible heritage. Preservation in Singapore has a top-down approach, meaning that a number of authorities such as URA, NHB, and the Tourism Board hold the power to decide what tangible is preserved. Then let us end with a question. How can we truly honor heritage when the people who form both the tangible and intangible are not even considered?
Another interesting question I would like to bring up is the context of Singapore's history. When we look at preservation anywhere else in the world, right, we're talking about thousands or maybe 500 years of history, whereas Singapore, the modern history, it becomes even difficult to define what it is and what kind of time frame are we looking at. Are we looking at before independence? Are we looking at post-independence? Are we looking at everything collectively? So now more than ever, we're not disagreeing that some buildings have to be repurposed, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's honoring the heritage. We have opportunities and the resources to create buildings that were old, right? That have a context of maximum like 50 years and adapt it into the present. And it checks all the 5 points that we brought up earlier. It's environmental, it makes financial sense, it preserves architectural integrity and cultural authenticity, and of course it establishes social continuity. But none of these things can actually happen without taking the perspective of communities. If we continue preserving buildings from the perspectives of the government and establishing what national monuments are, we are only looking at buildings that somebody has decided are important. But what about the communities? Why are we not preserving areas, whole areas and whole communities that kind of occupy these spaces? Because if we truly want to honor the heritage, right, heritage is not something you can freeze in time. It evolves with time and it changes, as in the example of Sri Mariamman Temple, right? We look at how it was initially built. It had only 3 stages of the crown, now it has 5. So it's evolving with the community as the time goes. And that's probably a good example of preservation. However, that's just one example out of the 9 that we're here to discuss today. And I feel like when we're talking about such grand monuments that Singapore chooses to identify itself with, 1 out of 9 is not enough. Thank you.
Okay, first I would like to talk about the Telok Ayer market which you mentioned before. So it has been, it uses like cast iron and it's more sustainable, and that's why it's still there. Then it's just not the outer facade. It reminds us of the multicultural things happening inside. Then I also disagree with how you say it's just Mariamman Temple. I can also say that it's just Golden Mile Complex, which doesn't have the culture inside. I think every other example, such as like if I take out the Bukit Brown Cemetery, it's still a cemetery, right? It has the people in it. It is a testament of different Chinese like people of different ranks in the Chinese culture coming together. So I could say the same to you. It's just the Golden Mile complex, which doesn't have the culture inside. And everything else is preserving it still. I will pass on to Ray.
Thank you, Paraaga. If we just remind the panel and for everyone here, the opposition has said before that it is difficult, right, to define the culture, right? It's a community effort to determine what to do with the space and what it means for our heritage. And I think the prime example from our 9 structures here today is the Old Changi Hospital. It's sat fallow for the last several years or so. And I think 2-3 years back there was a competition that was opened up to the general public to kind of figure out, create designs to figure out what to do with not only just the structure itself, but the surrounding land, because the surrounding land, it's the parcel of land that it sits upon. And one of the designs, I think the first base from that competition, right, was to deem the site as a stargazing sort of facility. It keeps the original structure, right, but it reuses it for that new purpose because respecting the site of the land, because there's less light pollution, it makes it easier to do your stargazing and to develop your photos for such activities. And I think this sort of dialogue, right, between the public, these various stakeholders, the public, the government, and the corporation companies, right, this is all part of that process. And even just reclaiming back this hospital, which had a storied history, right, being built by the colonial government, later on being used by during the Japanese occupation by the Japanese Imperial Army, and they're taking that, becoming a Singaporean hospital before it was discontinued. Being able to reclaim back this hospital for a new purpose, right? It helps us to, in a sense, reclaim that part of our heritage and history. We're accepting that these things happen, right? And by keeping the exterior of this facade, right, it's a permanent and visual reminder of our past, right? Having to confront that always has the public thinking, okay, what does this mean to us? And I think it adds more value to that site rather than simply saying that we demolish this and we'll build what we would like to build upon the site. Thank you. Just to, I guess, further add on to our previous discussion about one of the structures, for the Brigatima railway station, its new additional purpose of contributing to Singapore's healthy lifestyle living, right? The government's been promoting for the past several years or so. This added new purpose, I think, just helps to. It just comes together for the railway station, having to serve all these various places. You can go there because of different reasons, for history, for health, for entertainment, to just hang out with your family. Yeah, and I think that helps add value to all these experiences, and therefore by adding that value it helps to honor the site's past and its heritage.
Thank you, team. So now we'll start on the second conferring. You have 3 minutes to confer with the teams.
So the opposition has numerous times mentioned that when we preserve, right, we retain the shell and it becomes part of like national identity because people can associate history with that facade or building. We would say that's not true. Yes, it's maybe trying to freeze a fragment of history, but how is that honoring heritage? Like we've said earlier, heritage evolves, it changes with time. You can't freeze it in time. And first and foremost, conservation and preservation is about management of change. We don't just freeze buildings as they were, because that would be just pretending and lying to ourselves that we're trying to honor something if they don't serve any meaning in our modern society. And actually it was interesting that you brought out the Bukit Brown example, and as we know, a few years ago there was a lot of controversy around like building Lordy Highway over a cemetery. But we could also argue that actually 50 years before the highway was built, Bukit Brown was closed for burials, and the only people that visited was probably older generation that would want to honor their old relatives, and it was long forgotten by our modern generation. And the discussion only came to be because of this process of building a new highway. So it was also kind of interesting. Yes, wait, what was I trying to say? Oh, Changi Airport, another example that you brought up. It was the Changi Hospital. I apologize, I'm very nervous. So the first attempt to recreate Changi Hospital was in 2006, and then it was later announced that the projects proposed are not valuable enough, and then the land was returned back to state in 2010, and now the same thing is happening, that they had a competition, that they didn't really announce they announced the winners, but has there been any progress into actually making it happen? The building has been standing and occupying valuable land that Singapore does not have a lot of, since 1997, right? That's a lot of time. Like, you could be building more housing for people to facilitate growth of the population. You could be redeveloping the space, but just leaving it there to decay and saying that there's hopes of preservation does not do much to economy, environment, architectural integrity, cultural authenticity, the social continuity, the 5 points that we keep mentioning throughout the debate. Thank you.
So firstly, you talked about the land usage, right? The Singapore doesn't have enough land. So why talk about these historical buildings? Do you know there are like 18 golf courses in Singapore, and it's like the highest per capita in a country. Like, and together they make 1,800 acres. Compared to that, the Bukit Brown Cemetery is just 233 acres, which is like 1/9 of the whole thing. So now that does seem small, right? Comparatively, why not use like the other which are not like really connected to the history or culture of the place? And also, you spoke about the static element, or like, like freezing the building there. That's not what we're talking about. I think we have advocated like, again and again about the reuse and readaptability of the space. So firstly, you also spoke about for the National Gallery, it's just for tourists, which it's not. It's also, it has educational purposes, and also it's a daycare center as well. And then also I would like to tell that now the National Gallery it was a city hall and Supreme Court before. Yeah, there's no people there. It's not used as ever. Whenever you see it, you will think about it's like a tangible link to the history, because they are iconic buildings and like they've grown with Singapore. And another thing which I would like to bring up is the Bukit Timah railway station. Yes, it's not a railway station anymore, but like whenever you go there, you acknowledge the importance of the developing Singapore. And again, it's not frozen. It's now a hiking place. It has a cafe, and like you preserve it for its wildlife as well. Yeah.
I suppose just to add on to our discussion about the Bukit Brown Cemetery, right? I think it's important to recognize that often view of like redeveloping a space solely for like commercial purposes, right, or for housing purposes, is fairly limiting. I think that Bukit Brown, having been undisturbed for so many years, has provided like an ecological haven for many of Singapore's like species, and having this like undeveloped space provides a great opportunity for what to do with like Singapore's future with it. Do we really want it to continue on with like, our present redevelopment, or do you want to review it for a different opportunity for redeveloping Singapore's like future urban landscape?
Alright, so that's the end of the last crossfire. We will now proceed to the final remarks. Actually, before that, we have judges' questions. So thank you to the teams for all the exciting and the enriching debate so far. I'm certain the audience had a great time as well. So having gotten much food for thought from the debate, I'm sure the judges have much to weigh in on. So may I invite the judges to share their thoughts on the arguments presented, their personal experiences, and other remarks on the debate. I'll pass the mic.
Can we just stick with questions?
No conflict.
Hello?
Okay.
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. Oh no, that's embarrassing. Okay. Yeah. So I'd like to ask this. So my question is actually the same for both sides. So take it how you want to answer it. Because for me, what is coming across pretty much so is the question of power and authority. That's basically kind of like the iterative keywords that have come across. So from both sides, I'd quite like you to answer, like if you could, in your own opinion as well, who you think should really wield the power. I mean, we know the situation and the context of how Singapore operates. So with respect to this specific topic today, let's say, then who you think should truly wield the power, and again, probably more importantly, I think Eusebius has kind of like inferred as to what approaches could be taken. How should consensus building be brought up or developed? You can think about it for a bit.
So we would like to answer first. So our answer is both of them. The government and the people both play a role in making a decision of conserving the building. So I think the government plays a role because it's a board of the smartest people or the best in the industry who try to make this decision. But that does not mean we are disregarding the people. For example, in the Bukit Brown Cemetery, when they wanted to make the railway and stuff, so people they protested against it. They started like going on walks. They had tours. They had dances and plays there, and I think that had a huge role, and that's why it's still there's no like railway on here. And also, if we speak about the Golden Mile complex, so like the building ranked third when like 1,103 people voted during an online poll. So because they wish to preserve it. This was before it was taken over by the company which is taken over now. So there was a debate on like if they want to tear down the whole thing or just keep the preserve the facade at least. So there was a lot of public support. So that's why I feel both the government and the public play a huge role in making such decisions.
And just to add on to that, like it's the people who who recognize, right, the authority and their power that gives them their legitimacy. but without like an organizing governing body to provide leadership or to provide funding, right? Such projects will remain very difficult to like get off the ground and to complete. And so we believe that it's a dynamic, right, a relationship that like these three parties, corporation, government, and people, right, must have a say in the conservation of a building, right? But I do think that the focus, right, in this balance, right, people should have more of the power, right, to influence what should be kept and what, because they're the ones who are creating the culture. We are the ones who are creating the culture and our identity and how we recognize and use these spaces. Yeah.
I think it becomes kind of tempting to say that people actually hold power when I feel like it's not necessarily true, and then it becomes a very political discussion of what we think government should be, what is democracy, how do we perceive it, do we want an ethical or a non-ethical democracy, and it's a very slippery topic to discuss in public, I think. But I think we'll be lying to ourselves if we admit that currently in Singapore, people have the right to decide what gets conserved and what doesn't get preserved. Because it's not true. We have a number of different authorities, right, that do the job for the people. And like you've mentioned, yes, maybe these people are the smartest, but that in itself kind of devalues the meaning of heritage and people that create the heritage, right? Yes. So, like the UNESCO approach essentially kind of, or the alternative we're trying to propose is a good balance between the government and the people. Maybe instead of identifying national monuments, we look at different areas and sectors. We do cultural mapping. We identify areas where people are actually using and value the history that's been there, right? We don't like find a building, we think, oh, it's important because this and this happened, or this person signed this document here, we'll preserve that room or that space or a whole building, because it doesn't make sense logically, economically, or ethically. And last and foremost, everything in our modern world, I think, is decided by money and who has money. The common person in Singapore, right, we don't have the power to assemble. Of course, you can file a petition and go through the long bureaucratic process, but that does not actually mean anything gets done or that your voice is heard. So we want to urge for change, and maybe it's not ideal or necessarily even doable in like the next 5 or 10 years, but nevertheless, like on the topic of discussion, we need to do something about it to actually preserve and honor heritage.
One example would be Chimes. So Chimes is a building that used to be a common school. It's a religious building. But currently it is known for restaurants, foods, and events, which is against what the alumni and people who are related to this building wish it would be. Yeah. And
so I think what Seet tried to try is an example of power. That the Chimes actually was given award by UNESCO Asia Pacific, not because of this is a significance or no, but because of the heroic attempts of the private sectors. The owners decided to retain that, and even spending a lot of money to build the basements. It's a very complex thing because it's an MRT line below. And it's saved because all other schools in the area has been demolished. Even the school developed by Thomas Stamford Raffles is gone. It's become Raffles City. And the MGS is gone. So I think the question of power is about people's power. And also this coalitions between the state and the people. And organizations like Singapore Heritage, like the Komomo Singapore, Almost Singapore. These are the emerging power that will become like pushing the process of democratization of heritage. So it's not just heritage that is used to promote big Singapore story with super S, but Singapore stories, plural with small s. And that is, I think, that we trying to say that the heritage is really is about people, heritage is about community. And government is part of the community because the community vote the government, not the government creating the community.
Yes.
Second question. Okay. So this is for the NUS team. I want to focus on the sentence, the theme of the debate, where the focus is can only be done, right? So I think quite a lot of examples were given, a lot of emphasis about the processes may not be, or I would say negative examples, but is there positive examples where heritage buildings are honored in your view positively that has nothing to do with preservation? Because I think that would be a good example, because that is directly against what is written here, because it assumes that it can only be done through preservation. So do you have any examples where in your mind there is a successful attempt to honor buildings and heritage of buildings that did not involve preservation?
Right? Yes. Example is this building that you are in. This is not concert buildings. This is very ugly and sick buildings. You know the situations in SDE 3, SDE 1. Then we preserve it. We just make a hole here and turn this into a certified green mark super low energy building. And because of SDE 4 is producing more energy, then the energy surplus will be channeled here, and this will become net zero energy buildings. We're preserving almost 90% of carbon, embodied carbon here. We make this healthier buildings. Maybe we'll be well certified. And I think this is the way to go, because conservation is not just about nostalgia of the past, but how, as our argument at the very beginning, is about environmental sustainability. Because what we have now actually is not belong to us. It's from our ancestors, our predecessors. And this is belong to the next generations, our children, our grandchildren. So if we cannot shortchange them by keep demolishing, if concrete can be used for 2,000 years by the Roman and Colosseum are still standing, why the en bloc have to be 99 years? Why can't the en bloc rules extend it to 200 years? Why not every single structure built in concrete have the construction age based on it? So like People's Park Complex or Golden Mile. I think the concrete can stand for another 200 years, right? So it's a matter of any buildings. It's not selective because of illustrations for the Singapore stories. It's not about honor, but it's about ethics. It's about morality, whether we want to become the architects of needs or the architects of greed. I think the bottom line is conservation is really talking about ethics.
Yeah, and kind of to build on that, right? Like we mentioned Singapore's history a bit earlier. The buildings we preserve today, they're relevant now, right? But as we said, conservation is all about making old relevant to the present, retaining a shell that maybe, yes, now it connects to identity of Singapore, but who is to say that in 100 years' time it's still going to be relevant, right? Like, it's probably going to be either further redeveloped or demolished, which just postpones this process of, like not actually honoring the heritage and the eventual demolition of something because we're not establishing clear boundaries and priorities in our modern world. Yes.
ask questions?
What I interpret from your question is like, is there any way to honor without preservation, right? So do you think making a hole in this thing is you're honoring it? Or it just the people, the architects from here honor this building as such? Right?
We are honoring the earth, and we are honoring our ancestors, and we are honoring our grandchildren. Building is relative. Building can have right to die. So conservation is not really important. You don't need to rebuild buildings. See what happened to Ground Zero. You don't need to rebuild Ground Zero. You just keep it as a public park and keep the footprint and keep the memory alive. And then you build Ground Zero, new World Trade Center building on the other side. So sometimes demolition is also conservation.
It's also like you have to think that SDU 3 and 4, right? Like we're occupying it right now, right? So we don't have to actively preserve something to truly honor it because it's the people that inhabit a space that do the act of honoring and remembrance.
We can have one last judge question.
Okay. It's always hard to be the last one. I think as we talk, it seems like at least for me, listening in, the conversation is coming to almost like a convergence a little bit of terms. I understood SUTD's position of conservation or preservation as one of adaptive reuse, or extending the use. And at some point, especially in the end, it seems like that is also a range of definition that the NUS team is going towards, maybe not using the term exactly. So I'm just wondering at this point, because it took some time to get here, if indeed the physicality of the building, right, is indeed important. I guess that's also the questions that were raised before, coming back to that. I thought the example of the chimes, I didn't know that history, and as unfortunate that the other schools have been basically erased. But at that point, because you cannot go back in time, at that point, this is what we have left. And although how unfortunate and how kind of maybe annoying the situation is, that a private group with such sort of amount of resources would then be allowed to kind of have a final say almost. It's almost like it's a bit too late, right? So I felt, history evolves, it just keep marching, time keep going. So I felt like it's easy to go back and look retroactively, but at any one point, it seems like when the decisions have to be made, whether we have to erase or not, right? For me, the question is always, would the physicality of this thing be a reminder or be the kind of last gate, right, or last thing for us to be able to then, if you use the word honor, right, some level of connection that we have with our ancestors or with people in the past. I don't know if that's a question, it's just maybe more of a comment, I guess, at this point. But I think somehow we're talking all converging in this. Thank you. If there's any kind of response to that comment.
I think that is a very valid consideration to have, right? Does the physical structure of the building really connect? Does it serve as the boundary, the threshold, the last link to its heritage and past, or is it just merely like one doorway to which to go through and connect to that? I would say that at the very least, right, it is a very important way of connecting to the culture and heritage that surround a structure. Take for example, like one of the older structures here on our list, right, the Sri Mariamman Temple, right? It's been here before Singapore independence, right? So the city has literally grown up around it, and parts of like its street will reflect that, right? How that maybe it's like lower than the street level is because the street level was built above and around it afterwards. And so I think like not having certain parts of this physicality, being unable to spatially experience a structure, right, to be able to like practice in one extent or another what was done within a building, you sort of lose that sort of perspective. Like we as humans we're very experiential, so just seeing something like academically or even through like VR simulation, right? Sometimes it doesn't quite get to that level of understanding. So it'd be to that's why we advocate for the preservation of the structure, because we think that even though there are other ways of respecting, right, the building's background and history, but we think that preserving the structure itself, right, is most often the most surefire way of being able to do so.
Okay. So I just wanted to also just add, I really appreciate the conversation leading towards also the question, is it enough, right? Is it enough that we stop at? Of course not. So I really appreciate sort of that position that the NUS team is taking, sort of raising this question and how.
Okay. Just one blank. Yes, okay. Okay. Sorry. So, of course, like we have a certain understanding of why preservation is important because, like you said, we want to grasp onto the past, but we're talking about heritage and honoring heritage, and heritage about the earth. Heritage doesn't come from the buildings themselves, right? Like we mentioned earlier, it's a byproduct, and I feel like it's okay sometimes to let go of this because if the people keep living and they keep practicing their art and remembering what once was, the memory and honor of heritage will keep going on. And we need to, I feel like, be reasonable sometimes and identify what needs to be preserved and what doesn't need to be preserved, because there is this urgency to kind of grasp onto everything. And, you know, to me, it feels a little bit like a cheap trick, like we're pretending like it means something, but in actuality it does not. Like, of course, I'm a foreigner, I don't really have, I'm gonna wrap up, I don't have like emotional ties, but for example, the National Gallery, the Supreme Court room, right? It's a grand, I don't know, a place filled with history, and so many people have passed it at one point, but I've entered it and I felt nothing, because all the material surrounding me, like, they had no history, no soul, no emotional connotation, and architecture is meant to make us feel something. Otherwise, like, what's the point of doing anything with architecture?
Okay, so now we've concluded judges' questions. We will now move on to the audience questions. So everyone can take a minute to like think about any questions that you'd like to pose to the teams, and yeah, we will give the mic to whoever has a question from the audience. You can just read up and we'll pass the mic to you. I think.
Okay, hi. I just like to, for me, to analogize like this polarity is like how the Chinese do funerary rites of the Chinese. One can do a burial in which they have tombs, or one do a cremation and then they threw away the remains into the oceans. So one obliterates, so one honors the ancestor by having something physical to remember and visit the graves, or have it, completely obliterates. But then they have a ritual every year in Qingming where they visit the ocean and pay respects, in which one believes that it can be done without the physicality, right? And for say the NUS team or the SUTD team, that it needs a sort of a physical manifestation, a tomb. And then I would like to ask this question in terms of the building chimes, right? It was a convent, right, by the Catholics, by the nuns. It was a sacred space, right? But now it's used as a F&B, or sometimes they have events, or something, or even to the extreme is I think there's some church somewhere in Europe where it becomes like a nightclub, right? But it's still a Gothic. It does it's a Gothic church, but they do worldly things. One with a Christian people would say that. So is that a way that we still honor the heritage of the place by adapting, adaptively reusing the building, but not actually doing it in respect to its sacredness? And for instance, can you justify that now sacred buildings like chimes adaptively reused, but not as a place, a sacred space, but a place of leisure? Yeah, because cases of adaptively reused, for instance, the Hagia Sophia being actively reused by different religious communities, there's a continuation, right? But from different religion. But for instance, this is a total transformation from a sacred space to arguably a profane space. Yeah.
I guess before we get to perhaps the meat of our response, we would like to have it be noted that the convent itself, right, they did hold its last service and afterwards was deconsecrated. So in terms of having it be, profaned or blasphemed, that's not really a concern anymore for the space. They made sure to do that once they moved out to their new premises. But in terms of this usage, right, respecting the space, I guess if we go to the heart of what happened at Chimes, right, at the chapel, it was a place for, at its very basic level, right, it was a place for persons of different ages, right, to grow together, to communicate, talk with one another, right, to socialize and to build bonds. And in that sense, the chime still retains that particular purpose. It's become, the term would be ecumenical, or the idea of having persons from different backgrounds, religions, and races, right, all there, socializing, building bonds and community. So in that sense, the chapel and the grounds at Chimes, right, still serves that basic function. Yeah. And then I guess to address your concern about, or your questions, right, regarding the usage of the comparison you made, right, to term burial practices, right, does remembering or respecting our dead in the same way respecting our heritage and culture, right, does that require some sort of artifact or item, right? I think that it's a very fascinating thing to explore, and there's many various ways of doing so, right? There's different burials and there's different way of remembering things architecturally, right? It doesn't have to be just, a structure, but it could also be I think for Book of Brown Cemetery, they've digitized many of the tombstones there, so that persons whose families are related to the deceased and their remains there, right, they're able to then know whether these graves will be disturbed and then to take action based on that information. So I believe, I wouldn't say there's I wouldn't come out and say that there's any particular one way of doing it, but what is important is giving persons this dialogue, right, to figure out so what does this place mean to us, right, and then what do I want to do with it, and then to facilitate that discussion to have some sort of group consensus about it.
Yes, I think I'll just like kind of bring it back to what you were talking initially in your question. In the end, like everything with history kind of gets buried in layers, right? Like I don't think we can 100% remember every single thing or even attempt to grasp what happened in the past. So like what you said with scattering the ashes, of course then it's the same, it's a process of sacrifice, right, of something. And this process of sacrificing is what actually leaves an imprint in our hearts and our brains and lets us remember. So yes, I think it can be the same with structures.
To simplify, right, whether this physical is important or the non-physical is more important. For us, the intangible is permanent. The tangible is temporary. Everything is moving forward. What we need to preserve is the layers. Layers of memory, layers of histories, from past to present to the future. Regardless, it is the form. It could be form, it could be a physical form, could be intangible form, could be in the form of ash, of urn, or even diamond. Doesn't really matter because the form can change. But the memory and respect to our father and mother who already become an ash can take form in any way. In any form, can be in the graveyard, can be in whatever. So the intangible is more important rather than focusing on the tangible. Focusing on community values is more important rather than the physical form. Preserving the World Trade Center as a whole and a public park rather than to rebuild it on the same site is more important rather than to memorizing or creating the Twin Tower. So I think our positions remain the same, right? So we believe that we don't stuck with the past, we don't make pickles from a cucumber. But we keep growing the cucumber so we can produce different types of pickles in the future. But still it's a cucumber and pickles.
But I guess maybe just to close off on my own remarks, it would be that different persons have different beliefs, right? Maybe linking back to your reference about like the different burials, right? The different ethnicities of Chinese immigrants came to Singapore, right? And they have different religious beliefs. So some of them believe that no, the burial has to be physical, it has to be in the ground. Otherwise the soul will not rest and it wanders, right? Which is why we have the hungry ghost month. So I believe that the different persons have different beliefs, right? And so there'll be different levels of acceptance in terms of like whether we're able to respect heritage based on what we preserve. Well, some persons will be we don't need it, and some persons will believe very strongly that we do. And so I believe it's better to err on the side of caution to keep certain things, right, in order to give these persons like the freedom to choose, right, and to respect their ability to choose.
We can move on to our next audience question if anyone has any. This side. At the back.
Hi. I think a lot of the discussion about architecture in relation to history, there's a lot of talk about like preserving, celebrating, honoring, remembering. But I was also kind of curious about under what kind of situations can architecture also critique history? Because I think we all know that history itself is not always so simplistic, and there are also kind of questionable moments in time and questionable things and all that. So just like to hear what both teams' thoughts on how architecture itself, through the process of conservation, can perhaps be used as a tool to kind of ask certain difficult questions about history as well. Yeah.
A very good question, because I think in regards to Singapore, right, like I'm a foreigner, as I mentioned earlier. Coming here was very weird because you don't see memory of anything that's painful, right? Like I feel like colonialism is kind of praised and there's no or little memory of war, and it's presented in a very like pretty silver platter that's easy to digest and accept and move on, which to me seems very problematic because architecture, like Yisheng pointed out, is not meant to just celebrate things, but it also has the power to critique. And when we're giving the power to preserve to authority, and we have no power to influence their say, it becomes very dangerous for history to be erased. And then it becomes like a vicious cycle, right? We preserve something, we create a new narrative, or not maybe new, but we modify it, we make it picture perfect, and then the next generation eats it up, and the process continues on and on and on and on, which, once again, like the debate was about honoring heritage, and this process of kind of refining history, making it like perfectly round, is not honoring history.
Yeah, I think it just add a bit, yeah, where we need to preserve Auschwitz and Dachau. It's because of education for the next generations, not to repeat the same mistake. Same also in Singapore. The history of Singapore is not just white. There is some black and gray as well, right? So where is the history of the black and history of the red, history of the yellow, history of the greens in Singapore? So the danger of just selecting a certain things and then make it an examples in the textbook of architecture is dangerous for the education of the next generation, because precisely we say that it's forgetting this and then creating a new narratives. So architecture has the power to change that, actually, to remind people about the Singapore is not just white, that this is also gray and black and red and green and yellow. And we, as an architect, has the power of design, the power of persuasions, and the power of associations.
So in regards to being able to critique our history and our heritage in the first place, right? One must have examples. And so preserving certain buildings helps to give us that very physical example of such. I think the Space Hub in Asia, Space Hub Asia building, right, is one such interesting example. Its whole story, its process of how it was built, why it was chosen as a site, can be used as evidence to critique our whole process of preservation and the whole Singaporean history. It was the building itself, right? It used to be a former colonial building, right? So it stands as a stark reminder of in Singapore where our colonial history is looked upon a little more fondly because we treat it a little nicer, but relative to our other Southeast Asian countries. But still remembering that as a colony, right, we are second-class citizens. The country's labor and resources are exploited, right? All this economic value generated, all this worth, right, is generated, does not feed back to the locals, but goes back to the British Empire and the colonial master. So having the building preserved in the first place, right, helps us to remember, helps to counteract that perhaps a prevailing, more nostalgic, rose-filtered narrative of a more peaceful colonial past. Another thing would be how the free market itself, right, has chosen to preserve the building. It was bought over by a commercial enterprise, and they chose to keep the building and then further extend it with their own construction. So it creates this interesting hybrid of, colonial building in front, modern glass steel envelope in the back. And that whole process itself is something that we can critique as well. This is how we want to develop our architecture. This is the style that we want to adopt. And so I think having these more solid, concrete examples helps to really critique help us re-evaluate and critique history well.
I think there are more examples also. So the old Changi hospital, right? It kept the British used it to keep prisoners of war, and I think it's directly relatable to the way the hospital is right now. So again, it critiques. It doesn't glamorize, but it critiques what Singapore went through. Another example, it can also be the Sri Mariamman Temple. So the first bricklayer was built by imprisoned convicts. So I don't think that's glamorizing again. I think through such examples, we can say that architecture can be used to critique the past as well.
I guess maybe just to summarize, it would be that having these examples, right, helps us to continue to reevaluate the historical narrative that we've traditionally learned. For example, we learned in school Singapore as a sleepy fishing village. Was that really true before Raffles came, or when during that colonial era? Was it really that peaceful? Like, was there a more nuanced view of those circumstances? And these like living pieces of structural evidence that we can see, that we can touch, and that we can feel, right? These are all useful to bolstering our understanding, to prevent us from glamorizing and the past. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's all the time we have left for audience questions. We will now proceed on to our final remarks, starting with the opposition. You have 2 minutes to wrap up.
We have to recognize the good efforts made by Singapore to save heritage. For example, the Shuei temple has been well sustained by the community and seen as a living heritage and changes with time. However, we have been overly focused on retaining the tangible aspects of heritage, that most of the soul of these sites have been lost over time. We have to always keep in mind that the heritage moves forward with time, just like us and future generations. We have to be willing to extend our conservation efforts beyond the tangible to truly sustain Singapore's heritage for the future generations to look back on. Heritage is not, architecture is not just used to be stored or framed for the public to admire. It's a space for people to form memories and where the art of storytelling takes place. We have to also remember sustainability of the architecture as well, so different generations can utilize the same space with different and yet similar experiences. It's true that preserving heritage buildings does honor their heritage. However, the extent which this is successful can be questioned. At the end of the day, we have to look at the bigger picture and how communities have been affected through our efforts in conservation. Merely retaining the shell of what once was does not truly honor the past in our present.
Okay, and very fast impromptu ending. I'm pretty sure all of us have visited at least like 1 or 2 of the 9 buildings. My question to you, and I urge you, can you please raise your hand if when you visited the building, did you feel something in regards to the architecture? Not the environment, nothing else. If you felt something when you visited one of the 9 buildings, can you please raise your hand right now? Oh, but they don't? Okay, then disregard this.
And then just to wrap up for the final say, it is not about honor as number 1, but about ethics as a number 1. So ethics is mindset, behaviors is the one who really important to be nurtured in terms of conservation. And second, it's not about tangible or intangible, but it's all about layers. How we keep the layerings keep going on from past generations to future generations without interruptions, without editing, without trying to remove or to add something that is not really historical. Enough? Okay.
As we come to the close of this debate, we stand firm in our conviction that honoring the heritage of buildings in Singapore can only be achieved through their preservation. Preserving these heritage buildings is not merely an act of nostalgia, but a statement of our collective identity. By safeguarding these architectural gems, we ensure that Singapore's multicultural heritage, history, and traditions continue to thrive architectural conservation in a rapidly changing world. They can become lasting and living symbols of Singapore's history, culture, and identity. It is through preservation that we foster a sense of pride, instill a deeper understanding of our roots, and create valuable educational opportunities for future generations. The architectural diversity, cultural narratives, and historical contexts encapsulated within these adaptively reused buildings deserve our utmost care and respect. By preserving them, we ensure that the future generations can experience the same sense of awe and appreciation for their heritage as we do today. And as architects, spatiality and being the spaces make us feel and connect, and hence preserving these buildings means honoring them.
So we must recognize that heritage preservation is an investment to our cultural legacy. It strengthens our tourism industry, it stimulates economic growth, and it enhances our global reputation as a nation that values its past while forging ahead into the future. Preserving heritage buildings also aligns with sustainability goals and reduces environmental impact by retaining the embodied energy of the old building, and the carbon footprint is therefore reduced. The stories and memories embedded within these buildings cannot be replicated or replaced by new constructions. They are a testament to the ingenuity, craftsmanship, and vision of those who came before us. So through preservation, we demonstrate our commitment to valuing and cherishing the legacy of our ancestors, and we provide a tangible link between the past, present, and future. Together, let us honor the heritage of buildings in Singapore through the preservation that breathes life into our past, illuminates our present, and paves the way for a future where our cultural legacy remains alive and cherished. Let us strive to protect and honor these invaluable treasures so that the heritage of Singapore can continue to inspire, educate, and captivate generations to come. Thank you.
Okay, thank you teams for having such an exciting debate so far. Okay, now it's time for some judges' remarks before we close off for voting. Any other judges have any last remarks?
Jet lag is really hitting me now. I think it's like 2 a.m. Yeah, Eastern time. Yeah, Eastern time at the moment. East Coast time at the moment. Yeah, so a couple of things. I've been rereading the question, not just question, the statement, the debate statement, plus the abstract clarification. So my only thing was that I do get the sense that the abstract kind of has limited the scope of the debate somewhat. Again, so, and I also kept Googling the definition of preservation during this entire afternoon. And the one thing I noticed that nowhere does it actually say that preservation does not include allowing an existing building to deteriorate, or even a site to deteriorate in its natural existence. So I think that also needs to be addressed as well. Does really preserving mean that it has to be the edifice? So far, a lot of the conversations that come up is about edifice treatment as well. So that is also where I'm comfortable with, rather than just simply, again, it could be a structural preservation, but nowhere does it actually say that it does need any interventions have to be done on them. So again, so that's the one thing. Also the other thing that seems to have come up quite often throughout the exchanges this afternoon is there seems to be somewhat a conflation as well in terms of what is history versus what is heritage. And again, history is a very, very loaded word. But in the context of Singapore, most of allusions to what so history is mostly political history or even national history, which always seems to lead a lot of conversations in Singapore especially. And I'm saying this because I've just come back from Canada, and I've been really, really inspired by some of my meetings with First Nation leaders. And again, what they are going through, I've never experienced again with the inequality, ancestral lands still not being repatriated. So again, those are much, much deeper consensus issues as well. So yeah, so for me, I think we need to be quite careful in terms of the conflation between heritage and history. That seems to have been coming up quite often in this conversation. So yeah, that's my 10 cents worth.
I also have reread the topic many times throughout the debate. I think maybe it's something to do with the format. I can't remember how it was run previously, but, or maybe the topic itself, it's quite narrow to some extent, and I was struggling with the position of the teams because they had one round, and then they started to do crossfire, and the points were overlapping, and I couldn't get a very clear understanding until quite late in the debate what the position at NUS was and what SUTD was saying. And I don't know whether you all realize you're kind of talking about the same thing also. So in that sense, maybe for future formats it would be useful to have the teams develop their position a bit more or have a slightly longer introduction. I think the NUS team tried to explain the difference between preservation and conservation, but there wasn't a very clear definition also. You sort of touched on it and it moved on, right? And I think and it took a very political position, a very clear position about what is in Singapore and what is not good. And in that sense, I felt that there are maybe missed opportunities that we could have made a stronger case beyond conservation equals government action. So I think Prof. Widodo's position in the end was very clear. This building is an example of an act of preservation that has nothing to do with the government's position. Right? So I think that immediate link in the beginning may have derailed the argument a little bit. I mean, so that's just the position. I think SUTDs, I felt when I first read it, I thought you had an easier case to make. Because you can argue that, as you mentioned, this is but then maybe the final gateway through different modes of honoring that having a physical structure is important to link communities and memories to specific sites. And you also mentioned that the specific users can evolve. So in that sense, the physical structure does not need to be linked to its specific history and time. But I don't know where actually that dilutes your argument, because if you then the idea of only through preservation you can keep and honor, it actually requires a lot of other elements to come in to support that framing of the whole process of honoring, while arguing that the physical structure was important. So for example, I don't know whether how many of you are familiar with the history of Nanta, right? NTU, and the community who is actually still very active. And they are active as alumni all over the world, right? They have annual gatherings in Canada, in Hong Kong, in Singapore. But what is on site now is one or two structures, the physical gateway, the campus. So in that sense, it's a community that is thriving, that has very, very strong, that's honoring its roots, and a strong alumni that has actually very little direct link to the site now. So that's could be one example. I mean, coming back to Chimes and the convent girls' school, I think some of the points were raised. I just wanted to clarify, I don't know whether some of the students will go away thinking slightly different, that it was a sale site, right? The government took it back, and it was sold to a private developer through a public sale. And it was a requirement for the developer to retain and enhance and improve and all the other things. And so it wasn't the convent girls or the Catholic community that raised money to retain the structure. It was taken back and then it was launched as a sales site. And there are other school structures in the area that was kept. SGI was also still there, SAM, and I think Catholic High is still there somewhere in the back. Some structures were lost. RI was no longer there. I think, I can't remember, ACS was converted to a museum. So there are some structures here and there that's kept. So maybe just to clarify in case some different ideas.
Yeah, I really enjoyed today's session. I really particularly appreciate, I guess, the connection that NUS made about the sort of danger, right? Almost like a warning that the conservative science would be almost like an instrument, right, to control the narrative of a particular narrative of power. So I guess as the argument went through, it became kind of clear that buildings, though physical buildings, do have the power. And at some point, it seems like the critique is then, how can we then use this power? Right? So I hope that is the kind of hopefully coming together at the end about sort of our roles and our ability to then sort of be involved in this sort of creation of these, or to be made aware, or to enable the diversity of voices and stories that can be translated to the future. So I really appreciate that sort of comment or that position that the NUS team had to kind of bring that to the table. All right, I think that's
Alright, okay, that will bring us to the end of our debate for today. I hope you've had a good time listening to all the different arguments based from the NUS side, as well as the SUTD side. So now we will start to commence our voting. And as you can see at the board behind this audience then, we have the voting chart, and we will have red stickers now available for you to make your vote. So after listening to the different arguments made by the SUTD and the NUS team, please place your votes. And in the meantime, we will take like a 15-minute break before we come back for awards. You can walk around the